Everyone has a favorite color, but what if I told you that everyone who likes blue, everyone who wears blue, writes with blue pens, and has many blue items in general was dumb? Obviously, this makes no sense. There's no connection between your favorite color and your intelligence. But this is an example of how reductionist labels can be, where one aspect of your identity is used to determine the rest of your character and how you deserve to be treated. Trevor Noah's novel, Born a Crime, is all about labels, stereotypes, and discrimination. This autobiographical memorial discusses the consequences of apartheid, the effect centuries of systemic racism has had on South Africa and its people. The author in particular, having been born to a white father and black mother during apartheid, was understandably greatly impacted by it. He was born of mixed race in a country that outlawed race mixing. And there was one excerpt in particular about the way in which he coped in such an oppressive society that really grabbed my attention. Whenever Trevor Noah was approached by a stranger and asked about his identity, he'd simply reply in whatever language they addressed him in, and this would be enough to rid him of all suspicion. Somehow, something as simple as a shared language was enough of an indicator to show that he wasn't a stranger, that he wasn't someone who deserved to be discriminated against. I mulled over this for a while. Two people will always have something in common, but this isn't really something we actively think about or something that we're always aware of, but we're all human beings. The human experience is universal for all of us, with each of us living through some version of it. We all have hobbies, culture, a favorite color, etc. When we make these similarities apparent, we form friendships. We're reminded of our shared humanity. In this case, by speaking the same language, Trevor Noah demonstrates to the stranger that he can communicate with them. He reminds them that he's human too. And being able to share experiences, to relate to each other, that is empathy. And it's fundamental to our relationships. These areas of commonality are what bring us together. Now, this begs the question, why do people tend to forget that others are human? You'd think that we'd be more aware of this fact, seeing as we're all the same species, but this leads into my first point, the issue with labels, creator of the veil that separates us. To begin with, racism and sexism are both based on a certain label or some part of one's identity, race for racism and gender for sexism. It's important to note that both are also based on perception. In other words, whether someone will discriminate against another will depend on their expectations or standards of what each label should look like. So how much one seems to be a certain race, how feminine or masculine one appears to be in another's eyes. This will, of course, vary from culture to culture, as each has its own vague definition for each label. If we dig a little deeper, this is also associated with stereotypes. For example, wearing pink is seen as stereotypically feminine, and so is liking dolls. Someone who repeatedly sees evidence of both throughout their life, so repeatedly seeing girls, who are usually labeled as feminine, playing with dolls and wearing pink, will eventually accept this stereotype as truth. They will deem others who wear pink to be feminine, and will be surprised if those same people absolutely despise dolls. This someone will expect both notions to be true of someone feminine. They will assume that someone behaves in a certain way because of a label. This can, of course, become a slippery slope once certain negative behaviors are tied to labels, said labels become grounds for discrimination. Even today, women are twice as likely to receive an incorrect diagnosis after a heart attack, and 30% more likely to see their stroke symptoms misdiagnosed. Both afflictions can severely affect a patient's life with lasting consequences, but they're being left untreated because doctors have concluded it was either her hormones or all in her head. The underlying belief is that women are commonly perceived as emotional and hormonal, but this stereotype is untrue. A woman's hormones do not affect her emotional state to a greater extent than the other factors which influence that of a man's. Even just in general, women have been oppressed under systemic patriarchy for at least 6,000 years. And that's only from recorded history. Men and women have not been on equal footing on the basis of gender alone. Of course, this does not only apply to sexism. Many marginalized groups including racial minorities, disabled people, etc., have been segregated from the majority, denied their rights, and thereby dehumanized throughout human history. They're perceived as subhuman simply because they're born different. But how did these prejudicial stereotypes arise in the first place? There's a few ways in which a stereotype can form, and there's typically some kind of basis in reality, which is known as the grain of truth hypothesis. In 1967, psychologist Donald T. Campbell argued that an experience with an individual from a group will then be generalized to the group. To give an example of these phenomena, I want to raise a hypothetical scenario. Let's say we have two sheltered children, of neither having seen or heard of Asians in their lifetime. If this was child A's first exposure to Asians, what would they conclude about us? Based on this limited information, they'd probably think that we're all violent or crazy people. Obviously, this is very much untrue and does not apply to every Asian. But based on the grain of truth hypothesis, this is what child A will believe in. But if this was child B's first exposure, child B would likely draw a different conclusion from child A because these Asians are clearly much more elegant than those child A saw. Their personal definitions of Asian will differ because their experiences surrounding Asians differed. Even so, both perceptions are very much one-dimensional because of the limited amount of information given to them. So, logically, we should provide them with more. If both hypothetical kids see the full picture, and are told that yes, those crazy people are Asians too, and yes, these elegant people are Asians too, they'd probably be surprised, because they were under the impression that Asians had to behave a certain way. In this manner, they'd gain a more nuanced understanding of what constitutes as Asian. Even then, perhaps all they gather is that Asians must either be crazy or elegant, with no in-betweens, unable to understand that a spectrum exists. You can keep showing these children pictures of Asians and keep trying to give them a more nuanced understanding of the term, but we don't really have a definition concrete enough for that to be possible. Are there exact facial features that make you Asian? Is your mother tongue a basis for race? At what point do we stop classifying people as Asian? It depends on who you ask, and it's all made of vague, blurry boundaries. In contrast to the flexible definitions of Asian, the stereotypes associated with the label are quite rigid. People tend to tie certain characteristics to labels and treat these as almost universal truths. For instance, the most common stereotype when it comes to us Asians is that we're all really good at math. There is some truth to this, circling back to the grain of truth hypothesis, which is probably a result of the academic rat race present here in Asian countries. But of course, this is not applicable to all Asians. In fact, it may come as a surprise to some that not all Asians are great at math, even though we, as Asians, are already aware of the fact. This is known as the model minority stereotype. Many Asians, especially in countries where they're the minority, are expected to be high achieving. Their academic needs are ignored. There's stigma around asking for help, and they may be excluded from sources of support because of these expectations. Stereotypes, despite being accepted as true, are in reality merely half-truths. They're unable to account for the nuance that exists within these labels and are thus reductionist. Different people with different needs are given the same treatment for being under the same label. This is why people shouldn't be defined by their labels. They're essentially first impressions, a mental image of someone based on surface-level information, but simply an assumption. To be blunt, basing our judgments on labels alone is a self-imposed restriction on ourselves and our relationships because of the influence stereotypes have on how we perceive each label and the people who fall under them. But we can look beyond first impressions by getting to know someone. It's like doing more research, learning about their version of the human experience. And we can look beyond labels, look through this veil we created, in the exact same manner. Thank you.